I'm Nora Bennett, 35, and the night my parents celebrated 35 years of marriage, I sat at a long table where my chair felt 2 inches lower than everyone else's, facing a wall of glass that turned the lake into a sheet of hammered silver. Conversation rose and fell like a tide I couldn't catch, laughter skimming past me as servers threaded between chairs with white plates and careful smiles. Allison sat near the center under a spill of chandelier light, Patrick beside her, their son Mason twisting a paper straw and watching me as if he'd been given a part in a play. My father's voice carried over the clinking glasses, praising Allison's new boutique, while my mother added details like pearls on a string. I lifted my water and kept my hand still, the rim cold against my lip, the kind of quiet you practice when you've learned it's safer to be small. Then Mason slid his chair back and stood, a glass beaded with ice in his hand, and his eyes held mine as though he'd been waiting for a cue. He took a step toward me, and everyone leaned in without moving. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if any part of this reminds you of a room where you felt invisible, tap that like and subscribe so more people find stories that help them stand a little taller. I own a little coffee and bakery shop on a corner in Portland, the kind of place where the bell over the door rings, soft and honest, and you leave with flour on your sleeve if you linger too close to the prep table. I built it in my late 20s, one batch at a time, learning how to coax dough with patience and keep the books with a pencil when the computer scared me more than the rent. I was raised to be steady, save what you can hold. The doors speak kindly. Values that make you dependable in a crisis and easy to overlook at a celebration. My parents admired usefulness more than effort, and somewhere along the years that turned into a habit of handing my praise to my sister. When Allison won anything, the house filled with congratulations. When I managed to do well, the moment evaporated into advice about how to do better next time. It wasn't cruel so much as constant, a slow tap that shapes the stone, and by the time I was old enough to sign a lease on a storefront, I also knew how to disappear in a family photo without stepping out of frame. Driving north for the anniversary dinner, I kept the speed steady and the music low, a wrapped picture frame buckled into the passenger seat, the kind of simple gift that says, "Here's space for a new memory." Seattle met me with a pale evening sky and the clean edge of water. The restaurant was all light and polish, the napkins so crisp they held a fold like a promise. I felt the difference right away, the wallets and watches, the sheen of something expensive you can't quite name. An echo of the gap between my life of early mornings and wholesale flour and my sister's circle of launch parties and tagged photos. It was polite, it was pretty, and it let me know in small ways that I was visiting a world I could admire but not claim. I took my seat where the view swallowed the miles I'd driven and tried to let the room be what it was without measuring myself against it. The first signs were tiny, a cousin's shoulder turning just before my "hello," my mother's hand brushing past my gift to straighten Allison's flowers, my father's smile warming only when he looked farther down the table. Allison moved easily in it, used to the warmth, telling stories about fabric orders and brand meetings, and the people around her laughed on cue. I wasn't angry. It felt more like watching a play where I didn't audition, one of those evenings where your name lands short of the next conversation. The server set down bread and olive oil, and in the shine of the plate I saw a small face 2 chairs away watching me, a boy already fluent in which way the current ran. Mason turned the glass in his hand, ice knocking gently against the sides, and then he stood up, the room quieting without anyone asking it to, and took that single step closer, ready to say something he'd been told was true. Mason's voice cut through the clinking of glasses, sharp and clear enough to stop every sound around us. "Mom said you don't belong here," he shouted, then tipped the glass forward before I could move. The soda hit my lap in a cold rush that made me gasp. I could feel it soak through the fabric, sweet and sticky, creeping down my legs, while the room broke into laughter. My father chuckled as if it were harmless. My mother covered her mouth, still smiling. Even Allison leaned back, satisfied. The laughter rolled over me like a wave I'd already drowned in before. I reached for a napkin and blotted the stain as quietly as I could. The linen tore slightly between my fingers. I didn't say a word. Every movement felt heavy, but I kept my face still. My father leaned over to Allison and said something about kids speaking their minds. My mother added that Mason just had an honest streak, nothing more. No one asked if I was all right. The conversation picked up again, and the sound of forks against porcelain filled the air as though nothing had happened. The ice from the drink began to melt against my skin. I excused myself, careful not to scrape my chair on the floor, and walked out into the hallway where the air was cooler and less perfumed. My reflection stared back at me from the mirror above the buffet, a faint outline of wet fabric dark against my dress. I wiped the spot with the back of my hand, but it didn't matter. The stain wasn't the kind you could wash away. I didn't go back to the table. Instead, I walked through the corridor past the framed photos of the lake and the soft music playing in the lobby until I reached the parking lot. The evening light had dimmed to a soft blue, the kind that sits quietly on the water before night takes over. I unlocked my car and sat behind the wheel, breathing in the faint smell of coffee that always lingered on my clothes. The laughter still echoed in my head, tangled with years of smaller moments that looked different but carried the same message. A birthday I barely remembered because it wasn't celebrated. A graduation they couldn't attend because Allison had an event that same weekend. The first time I brought them pastries from my shop, and they said it was sweet but unnecessary, then asked if Allison could use my kitchen to film a promo for her store. I started the car and watched the restaurant through the windshield. From the outside, it looked like a postcard, the windows glowing guests smiling, my family somewhere inside, raising another toast. I turned onto the main road, the taillights behind me blurring into a red ribbon in the mirror. The drive back to Portland stretched long and quiet. Streetlights glowed against the wet pavement. I kept the radio off, letting the hum of the tires drown the noise inside my head. Every time I blinked, I saw Mason's grin, his hand tipping the glass. The look in his eyes wasn't his own. It was something he'd learned, the same tone that had lived in our house for decades, subtle enough to pass for humor, sharp enough to leave a mark. When I reached my apartment, the clock on the microwave read 12:37. I didn't turn on the light right away. I dropped my purse on the counter and stood in the dark for a while, listening to the city's distant hum outside my window. My dress clung to me cold now, a faint stickiness at the hem. I poured a glass of water and sat at the table, letting the quiet settle around me. I thought about how long I'd been trying to keep peace, the phone calls on holidays, the gifts mailed on birthdays, the times I covered part of their bills just so they wouldn't argue. Every gesture I made to stay included only confirmed that I was the one expected to bend. Somewhere along the way, I'd mistaken endurance for love. The computer sat on the corner of my desk, its small blue light blinking like it was waiting for me. I opened it and scrolled through my bank account, then stopped at a single line that had followed me for years: loan cosigner Nora Bennett. I stared at those words until they blurred. That signature had been my father's request, or more accurately, his order when Allison wanted to open her boutique. "You have the credit," he'd said. "Family helps family." That night, I clicked into the account settings, my finger hovering over the button that would remove my authorization. My heart beat hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. For a moment, guilt whispered in my ear, the kind that always shows up right before you stop obeying. Then I pressed it. A message flashed on the screen confirming the request. I exhaled slowly, the sound small but final. Outside, the city was still asleep. I opened the window and let the cool air drift in. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn sounded long and low. It reminded me that movement was still possible, even after all the years spent standing still. When morning came, sunlight filtered through the blinds, cutting across the kitchen floor in thin stripes. I brewed coffee, the smell filling the apartment until it felt like home again. As I stepped onto the balcony, mug in hand, the world below was already stirring: a delivery truck turning the corner, a dog barking in the courtyard, a tow truck idling across the street. At first, I didn't think much of it. But then I recognized the car hitched to its back, Allison's white SUV. The same one she bragged about during family dinners, the one bought with that loan. Neighbors stood watching from their porches, whispering as the truck lifted it slowly into the air. The sunlight flashed off the chrome bright and final before it rolled away. I didn't move from where I stood. I took a sip of coffee, the steam brushing my face. Down the block, someone asked what had happened, and another voice answered, repossession. The word hung there like an echo of all the unspoken things that had built up for years. By 8 o'clock, the pounding on my door started. Sharp, fast, unmistakable. I didn't rush. I set my cup on the counter, smoothed my hair, and opened it. Allison stood there, her face pale, eyes wide, still wearing the same perfection she'd always tried to hold on to, only now cracked around the edges. She held a handful of crumpled papers, the loan documents creased and trembling in her hand. "You're destroying the family!" she shouted, her voice breaking halfway through, all because of a childish prank. Her words echoed down the hall, doors creaking open nearby as neighbors peeked out. I stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, the other at my side. She flipped through the papers as if the ink might rearrange itself. "Do you understand what you've done?" she cried. "The shop rent, Mason's tuition, everything depends on this. You can't just pull out and walk away." I didn't answer. Her voice filled the space between us, frantic and uneven. She said our parents would never forgive me, that I'd regret this, that family meant sacrifice. The words bounced off the walls and fell flat at my feet. When she ran out of things to say, the silence grew heavy. Her hands dropped to her sides, and for the first time I saw the uncertainty in her eyes. She took a step back, breathing hard, then whispered, "You'll regret this," before turning away. The door clicked shut behind her. I leaned against it for a moment, the rhythm of my heartbeat steady in the quiet. The morning light streamed across the floor, soft and calm. I poured another cup of coffee, sat on the sofa, and listened to the city waking outside. For the first time in years, the noise of my family wasn't louder than my own thoughts. The air felt lighter, the silence no longer heavy, but clear. I didn't know what would come next, only that something had shifted for good. And as I sat there, the faint trace of coffee and sugar filling the room, I knew the world had finally begun to turn without their hands on it. The morning after Allison's outburst, the calls began. My phone lit up before sunrise, each vibration echoing through the apartment like a warning. First came my mother's voice, calm on the surface, but sharp underneath. "Nora, sweetheart, don't make this worse," she said. "Allison already feels terrible. You know she didn't mean for things to go this far. We can fix it if you just undo whatever you did at the bank." Before I could respond, she added softly, "Your father and I can't keep defending you if you keep acting out." I ended the call without a word. It rang again seconds later, my father's number this time, then Allison's name flashing on the screen again and again until the phone went silent. The quiet didn't last. Messages poured in pleas mixed with threats, guilt written in familiar handwriting across my screen. At first they tried kindness. "You're her sister," my mother said in another voicemail. "Family sticks together." But when I didn't reply, the tone shifted. "If you don't reverse this, we'll have no choice but to cut you off for good." By the third day, my voicemail box was full. I muted the phone and tried to focus on work. The smell of cinnamon and bread filled the bakery. Customers chatted softly, and for a few hours each morning the noise of the world felt far away. But even there, my peace didn't last. One afternoon, as I wiped the counter, a new notification buzzed. It was a video from social media forwarded by a friend. I tapped it and the sound hit before the image loaded. Mason's laughter, loud and unfiltered. He stood in a backyard with a few boys his age, holding a cup of soda. "Aunt Nora doesn't belong here," he shouted, pouring the drink over his shirt while the others howled with laughter. The camera shook from whoever was filming. I watched the clip twice before setting the phone down. The room felt smaller, the air thick. I turned off the lights early that evening, locked up, and stepped outside into the cool air. The street was quiet except for the hum of traffic in the distance. When I reached my car, my breath caught. Long, deep scratches ran across the driver's door, jagged lines cutting through the paint. My hands trembled as I moved closer. Someone had dragged something sharp, a key, maybe from the front fender to the back. Then I saw the bakery window behind me, a web of cracks spread across the glass sunlight, glinting off tiny shards on the ground. The air smelled faintly of metal and dust. I unlocked the door and went straight to the security screen inside. The footage played in gray light. Two figures in hoodies appeared at the edge of the frame, moving quickly. One laughed, the sound muffled but unmistakable. Mason. He held a metal bar, swinging it once-twice until the glass splintered. His friend dragged a key along my car door. They both bent over filming it like it was a joke. I froze. The video played again automatically, looping back to the moment the glass shattered. For years I'd absorbed the hurt quietly, the dismissive comments, the favoritism, the jokes brushed off as love. But this was different. Something in me tightened, not out of anger, but resolve. I couldn't let this slide. The next morning, I called Tom. He listened quietly as I explained everything, the vandalism, the messages, the video. There was a pause before he spoke. "Send me everything," he said. "And Nora, don't delete a thing. Not one message." When he arrived at the bakery later that afternoon, he carried his old briefcase and a look I'd only ever seen when he was serious. We sat at one of the small corner tables while the shop was closed, the smell of sugar still lingering in the air. He opened his laptop and started going through the files I'd sent. "This is clear evidence," he said, pointing to the timestamp on the footage. "The faces are visible, the act deliberate. You can't let them treat this as family drama. It's vandalism, plain and simple." He called a contact at the police department, then turned to me. "You're filing a report today. I'll go with you." The police station felt colder than I expected, its fluorescent lights humming overhead. A woman introduced herself as Investigator Dana Ruiz and led us into a small office with walls lined in folders. I told her everything from the soda at the restaurant to the TikTok video and the smashed glass. Tom filled in the legal details about the loan and the harassment messages. When she finished typing, Investigator Ruiz looked up from her notes. "We've had a few minor reports involving that boy," she said, "but nothing this clear. You did the right thing coming in. We'll open a case file and handle it from here." The words settled into the room, steady and final. For the first time in a long while, I felt something shift, not relief exactly, but a kind of balance returning. She handed me a card with her direct number and told me to expect updates within a week. That evening, after Tom left, I sat alone in the bakery. The repaired glass reflected the soft light inside. I replayed the events in my mind, every word and every silence that had led me here. The next few days moved in small steps, calls from the police, statements from witnesses, and emails confirming that the footage had been preserved. At home, I gathered every document that still tied me to Allison or my parents, the co-signed lease, the secondary accounts, the old credit card. Each one carried their name next to mine, a trail of invisible strings. I spread them across my kitchen table, page after page, the paper cool beneath my hands. It was time to cut through them all. I contacted the landlord of Allison's boutique, sending formal notice prepared by Tom's lawyer friend, Rebecca Kim. She handled the language carefully, every sentence exact. I withdrew my name from the lease, the business registration, the payment platforms I'd once helped her set up. Every confirmation email that arrived after felt like a small door closing quietly behind me. One by one, I erased the traces that had kept me tied to a life that wasn't mine. By the time the last document was signed, the table was empty. The next week, the police called again. Investigator Ruiz informed me that the evidence was solid and the case would move forward under vandalism and harassment. She also mentioned that the juvenile division would reach out to my sister about counseling requirements for Mason. I thanked her and hung up, sitting for a while in the quiet. Outside, rain started to fall, soft at first, then steady against the windows. I watched the water slide down the glass and thought about the years I had mistaken endurance for peace. My phone buzzed on the counter, another message from my mother, this time shorter than usual. "You went too far." I didn't reply. Instead, I took my apron from the hook, tied it around my waist, and started mixing a new batch of dough. The scent of yeast and sugar rose slowly, filling the room. The mixer hummed steady and certain, drowning out the rain. For the first time in months, maybe years, I knew exactly what I was doing. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was rebuilding one decision at a time. Later that night, I sat at the kitchen table again, flipping through the final legal papers Tom had dropped off. Each line confirmed what I already knew: I was free of their financial control. Allison's shop, her debts, her mess, none of it could reach me now. Still, I knew it wasn't over. Families like ours didn't stop quietly. There would be whispers, more calls, maybe even something worse. But this time I had something they never expected me to have proof, and the law standing beside me. When I turned off the lights and walked to bed, the rain had slowed to a soft drizzle. The world outside felt calmer. I lay awake for a long time, listening to it fade into silence, knowing the real storm was only beginning. It had been just over 2 weeks since I'd filed the police report when my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end was hesitant, almost trembling. "Hi. Is this Nora Bennett?" I said yes, waiting for her to continue. "My name's Hannah. I used to work at your sister's boutique." The pause that followed was long enough for me to sense she'd been building up courage before calling. "I need to show you something," she said. "I think you should know what's been going on." We agreed to meet that afternoon at a small cafe on the other side of town, one that wasn't tied to my shop or my family. The rain had just started when I arrived, tapping lightly on the awning as I waited inside. Hannah walked in a few minutes later, clutching her phone so tightly that her knuckles were pale. She looked younger than I remembered, nervous, but determined. Without ordering anything, she slid into the seat across from me. "I don't want to be in the middle of this," she said, lowering her voice, "but what they're doing isn't right." She unlocked her phone and scrolled through screenshots. The words glared up from the screen like bruises, a string of messages between Allison and my mother. "We need to make people think Nora isn't stable." Another reply followed. "If she looks unreliable, no one will take her side about the finances." There were more plans to talk to relatives to suggest that I was having emotional issues. I read them all silently while the cafe's chatter faded around me. Hannah's voice wavered as she said, "I found these in a workgroup chat." "I didn't mean to, but when I saw your name I took screenshots before they deleted them." I thanked her, my words coming out slower than I expected. She looked relieved just to hand me the phone. "Please don't tell them I called," she whispered before leaving. When she was gone, I sat there for a long moment, the glow of the screen reflecting off the table. My mother's words, so careful and calculated, didn't sound like her voice at all, at least not the version I'd spent my life trying to please. That evening, I forwarded everything to Tom. He answered almost immediately. "This changes everything," he said. "They've moved from manipulation to defamation. We'll add it to the record." He had me send copies to Rebecca Kim, who was now handling the civil side of things. When she read through the messages, her tone turned sharp. "This is a deliberate attempt to damage your reputation," she said. "We'll make sure the court sees that." I thought that would be the end of the surprises, but the next call came only 2 days later. This time it was from a man named Mark Sullivan, a supplier who had provided fabric to Allison's boutique. His voice was steady but cautious. "I just need clarification," he said. "Did you approve these new orders?" He emailed me the documents before I could even answer. When the file opened, I felt my stomach drop. There, printed neatly beside Allison's name, was mine. Nora Bennett, co-owner. My signature forged perfectly. The invoice was dated just a month earlier, long after I had cut every tie. I called Tom again, my voice shaking. He came by that evening, Rebecca joining us over video call. When I showed them the file, Tom's jaw tightened. "This is fraud," he said. "And it's traceable." Rebecca nodded from her screen. "We'll add impersonation and financial misconduct to the existing claims. Once the supplier provides a statement, we'll have what we need." She spoke in the calm, precise tone of someone who knew exactly how to hold a crumbling wall in place long enough to expose what was behind it. Within a week, everything began to unravel around my sister's business. The boutique's doors stayed locked, a printed notice taped to the window, reading "Closed until further notice." Through a friend, I learned that the landlord had served an eviction order. The online store went down soon after, replaced by an error message where the brand name used to be. The collapse spread faster than I'd imagined, credit accounts frozen, suppliers demanding payment, customers posting complaints. I didn't celebrate. There was no satisfaction in watching it happen, only a kind of quiet disbelief. The world had turned, and the truth had done what I never could. It made them answer for their choices. Tom gathered the new evidence into one thick folder, screenshots, invoices, forged documents, and passed it to Rebecca to file with the court. "It's all connected now," he told me. "Once the hearing date is set, the judge will see the full picture. In the meantime, the community that once admired my family started whispering. A customer leaned across my counter one morning, speaking low. "Everyone used to think your parents were the perfect couple," she said. "Now people are realizing how deep the favoritism went." I nodded politely, pretending to focus on the espresso machine, but inside I could feel the weight of years shifting in ways I couldn't have forced if I'd tried. That weekend, I received an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single line written in block letters: "Stop before you destroy everything." I took a photo of it and texted it to Tom. He replied right away. "Keep it. We'll add it to the harassment record." His steadiness anchored me again. By the time the court date was announced, the tension around the family had become almost visible. My parents stopped showing up at church, and friends who once praised them began keeping their distance. Every time my phone buzzed, I half expected another threat. But what came instead were updates from Rebecca, case numbers, court filings, hearing confirmations. Each message felt like another brick added to something sturdy. When the day finally came, I stood at the base of the courthouse steps, my palms cold despite the summer air. The building rose gray and solid above me, sunlight catching on its windows. Inside, I could hear the muffled echo of doors closing somewhere down the hall. Tom walked beside me, briefcase in hand, and said quietly, "Just tell the truth. That's all you need to do." In the courtroom, the air felt thick and still. Rebecca took her seat beside me, her folders stacked neatly on the table. Across the aisle, Allison sat with her husband, her shoulders drawn tight. My parents were just behind them. My mother's eyes slid past me as though I were a stranger she'd once known in passing. The proceedings began with the video footage, the vandalism. The laughter Mason's voice clearly captured on tape. The room went silent when the sound played the scrape of metal against glass echoing through the speakers. Next came the forged invoices and the messages Hannah had saved. Her voice shook as she testified, but every word landed firmly. When it was my turn, I stood my notes trembling slightly in my hand. I told the story as plainly as I could, from the anniversary dinner to the calls, the videos, the damage to the shop. I spoke about the years of quiet endurance, the loan I'd co-signed, and the moment I chose to step away. I stopped before explaining how it felt. The facts were enough. Rebecca guided the rest carefully. The defense tried to dismiss it as a family misunderstanding, but the evidence on the screen, my forged signature, the messages plotting to discredit me, left no room for that. The judge, a woman with sharp eyes and a calm voice, listened without interruption. When the arguments ended, she folded her hands and spoke clearly. "This is not a domestic dispute," she said. "It is unlawful behavior that carries real consequences." Her ruling came with precision. Allison and her husband were ordered to compensate me for damages totaling $32,000 for repairs losses and legal costs. Mason was assigned 200 hours of community service and counseling. The judge added one last statement that hung in the air. "This family must understand that enabling harm teaches a child to repeat it." When the gavel struck, the sound was almost soft, but it echoed through me. The room stayed silent for a long moment before people began to move. I gathered my papers, feeling the weight lift from my shoulders in a way I hadn't felt since childhood. Outside, sunlight broke through thin clouds, the air sharp with the scent of the sea drifting from the bay. Tom placed a hand on my shoulder and said quietly, "You did it." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The wind caught a few leaves at our feet, scattering them down the courthouse steps. We walked together toward the parking lot, neither of us saying much. The relief didn't come all at once. It arrived in small breaths in the quiet between our footsteps. Ahead of me stretched a road I hadn't seen before, not free of scars, but mine to walk. That night I locked up the bakery later than usual. The hum of the refrigerators and the faint smell of bread filled the room. I wiped the counter one last time and glanced toward the window. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the dark. Somewhere out there, my family's world was collapsing, but mine was finally standing steady. As I turned off the lights and headed home, I had the feeling that the hardest chapter was ending, but another one was already waiting just beyond the door. After the verdict, I thought the noise would fade. For a few days, the quiet fooled me. The bakery filled again with the steady rhythm of mornings, the doorbell chime, the hiss of the espresso machine, the murmur of customers warming their hands around coffee cups. But the peace didn't last. The first sign came a week later. When I arrived to open the shop, a word had been sprayed across the side wall in red paint: "Traitor." The letters were large, dripping down onto the sidewalk. I stood there for a moment holding my keys, the smell of wet paint sharp in the cold air. I took a picture and sent it to Investigator Ruiz. Her reply came fast: "We'll file it as additional harassment. Don't touch anything until we arrive." By noon, the graffiti was documented, and a city crew had already scheduled its removal. 2 days later, someone stuffed my mailbox with torn paper scraps covered in the same word. I reported that too. This time the police didn't treat it like a small matter. They came by, took the notes, and said quietly, "We won't let this get out of hand." The difference wasn't just in their response, it was in me. I didn't flinch the way I once would have. I didn't cry or clean it up myself. I documented, I called, I moved on. The law was on my side now, and that changed everything. The following morning, a reporter from a local paper stopped by the shop. She introduced herself politely and asked if I'd be willing to talk about what had happened, the vandalism, the court ruling, and how I was rebuilding after it all. I hesitated, but she smiled kindly. "People are talking," she said. "I think they'd like to hear your story from you, not rumors." A week later, the article appeared under the headline, "The Woman Who Stood Up Against Toxic Favoritism." It described my journey from being dismissed by my own family to standing on my own 2 feet. The piece was simple, factual, but honest. By the next morning, customers came in asking about it. Some offered quiet congratulations, others just nodded with understanding. Business grew faster than I expected. The line stretched to the door most mornings, and for the first time, I had to hire more help. The shop that had once been my refuge became something bigger, a gathering place, a reminder that resilience had its own warmth. But success didn't erase the past, it just made its absence less heavy. Every time I saw a family sitting together in the cafe, I noticed the way they leaned toward each other, the easy laughter between them. It didn't hurt anymore, but it left a space, a quiet, that used to be filled with trying too hard. By late fall, the bakery had doubled its sales. We added a small corner display with my signature pastries, and customers started calling them Bennett buns after the article. A few weeks later, I received an invitation to an awards dinner hosted by the Portland Small Business Association. The letter said I'd been nominated for Small Business of the Year. The night of the ceremony, I stood on the small stage lights, bright and warm against my face, the applause steady and kind. When my name was announced, I walked up, the sound of clapping echoing through the hall. I spoke only a few words about work community and how strength often grows quietly while no one's watching. I didn't mention my family. I didn't need to. The crowd understood enough. Afterward, people I'd never met shook my hand. A woman said, "My daughter needed to hear your story." Another added, "It's good to know you can rise without cruelty." Their words stayed with me long after the evening ended. While my days filled with light, word of my family's struggles came in pieces. Through neighbors and mutual acquaintances, I learned that Allison's boutique had filed for bankruptcy. Several suppliers sued over unpaid invoices, and her husband Patrick lost his job after the scandal spread through their social circle. My parents, once pillars of their church and community, began skipping Sunday services. Someone told me my father tried to speak during a gathering and was met with silence. It wasn't revenge that I felt, just balance returning to where it always should have been. I didn't reach out, and they didn't either. The distance between us had become something solid, no longer painful to touch. One rainy afternoon, I stayed late to close the shop. The rain tapped softly against the front window, blurring the streetlights outside. I was wiping down the counter when I saw movement through the glass, 2 figures standing under the awning, still and silent. My heart slowed as I recognized them. My parents. They stood together, not knocking, not waving, just watching. My father had his hands in his coat pockets. My mother's umbrella hung limp at her side. The years between us sat in that quiet space like fog, thick but gentle. I didn't move. I kept wiping the counter, straightening the display trays, pretending not to notice. After a minute, I turned off the lights. The cafe darkened except for the faint glow from the street. When I looked again, they were gone. I locked the door, drew the curtain, and stood for a moment in the silence. There was no ache, no anger, just stillness. Maybe they had come to say something they couldn't, or maybe they just wanted to see what my life looked like without them. Either way, the visit needed no words. That night I lay in bed listening to the rain soften against the window. I thought of the road that had brought me here, the long drives home in tears, the years of silence after each small humiliation. The soda poured across my lap. And now this peace that didn't depend on anyone's permission. The next morning I arrived early at the bakery. Dawn was just beginning to tint the sky pink over the rooftops. I brewed the first pot of coffee, its scent filling the shop. A new day, unremarkable, but entirely my own. There were still rumors in town, people speculating about whether my family and I would reconcile, whether Allison would recover, whether I would forgive. But forgiveness, I'd learned, isn't always a door you walk back through. Sometimes it's just a window you open to let the air clear. Customers trickled in, familiar faces smiling as the morning light stretched across the floor. I handed a woman her order and caught my reflection in the glass behind her tired yes, but steady. I no longer carried the weight of trying to be enough for anyone else. By the end of that week, I received a handwritten letter from Tom. Inside was just one line: "You can rest now. The rest will take care of itself." I set it on the counter beside the register. The paper curled slightly at the edge from the warmth of the room. Outside, the clouds began to break, a thin line of sunlight cutting through. The world had moved on. So had I. But somewhere deep down, I could feel that life wasn't quite finished teaching me what freedom meant. And as the morning crowd filled the shop again, I had the sense that someone was still on the horizon, waiting to test that peace I had finally found. The days after my parents' silent visit moved in slow rhythm, each one blending into the next. The bakery was busier than ever, the hum of conversation mixing with the scent of coffee and sugar each morning. Customers smiled when they saw me, and I could tell most of them knew the story. It had stopped being gossip and turned into something else, an example of how standing up could look quiet but firm. Still, there were moments when the past brushed close, like the sound of a door opening in another room. It started small again. One morning, an envelope slid under the bakery door before dawn. Inside was a folded sheet of paper with a single sentence, "You ruined everything." The handwriting looked like Allison's. I called Tom, who told me calmly to keep it and forward a photo to Investigator Ruiz. She logged it as a follow-up to the harassment record and promised to monitor any new contact. A few days later, I saw Mason near the corner of my block standing by a parked car. He looked older, somehow taller, withdrawn. When he noticed me locking up, he hesitated and then crossed the street. His hood was pulled low, his hands buried in his pockets. "Aunt Nora," he said quietly. His voice cracked a little. "Mom says you hate us." I set the keys in my bag and looked at him. "I don't hate you, Mason." But what happened was serious. He shifted his weight, eyes fixed on the sidewalk. "They're always fighting now," he said. "Dad's not home much. Grandma cries all the time." For a moment he looked like a child again, unsure, lost inside something too big for him. I told him to stay in school, to listen to his teachers, and to treat people better than he'd been taught to. He nodded, murmured a small sorry, and walked away before I could say more. That evening, I sat in the quiet bakery after closing. The chairs were stacked, the floor swept clean, but the conversation with Mason lingered in my mind. It wasn't forgiveness. I felt it was understanding, the kind that arrives when the noise finally stops. The next morning, I found another message on my phone, this one from a number I didn't recognize. "You'll regret humiliating this family." I sent it straight to Investigator Ruiz, and she called back within minutes. "We've opened a follow-up report," she said. "Keep documenting. Don't respond." Her tone was steady, confident. It helped. Weeks passed and the tension began to shift. The harassment tapered off as the investigation continued. One afternoon, Investigator Ruiz called to let me know that a warning had been issued to my sister and her husband after a review of the evidence. "If they contact you again in any threatening way," she said, "it'll move to a restraining order automatically." I thanked her, the words simple but full of the relief I hadn't known how to express. The winter came early that year. Frost coated the windows each morning, and the smell of cinnamon rolls filled the shop before sunrise. Somewhere in the stillness of those cold mornings, life settled into a new rhythm. I started teaching short baking classes for high school students on weekends, showing them how to make bread from scratch. They were clumsy at first, scattering flour like snow, but their laughter filled the place with a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. One Saturday after class ended, an older woman from the neighborhood approached me. "I read your story," she said. "My daughter went through something similar. You reminded her she could start over." She pressed a small card into my hand, an invitation to speak at a community event about resilience and self-worth. The idea of standing in front of strangers again made my stomach tighten, but I agreed. The event took place in a local library auditorium, the kind of room that smelled faintly of paper and history. When I walked to the podium, the audience was quiet waiting. I talked about small steps, the kind that feel impossible at first, but build a foundation when no one's watching. I told them about running a business alone, about finding peace in work, about boundaries that didn't mean hatred, but self-respect. When I finished, the applause was soft, then grew louder until it filled the space. Afterward, several people came up to me sharing their own stories. Some were daughters who had been silenced, others parents trying to rebuild bridges they'd once burned. Their words settled deep inside me, not as sympathy, but as connection. That night back at the bakery, I placed the invitation card beside the register as a reminder. It wasn't fame, I felt it was something quieter, something that belonged only to those who had walked through fire and found air on the other side. By early spring, I received a letter from the Portland Small Business Association inviting me to a mentorship program for young entrepreneurs. The award from months earlier had caught their attention. They wanted me to lead a short series on financial independence and women-owned startups. I accepted without hesitation. Teaching others how to protect themselves financially felt like the natural next step, a way to use everything I'd learned the hard way. The first session was small, just 10 women sitting around folding tables with notebooks open. I started by telling them what no one had ever told me, that generosity without boundaries becomes a trap, and that saying no isn't cruelty. The words felt heavy but true, and for the first time I realized I wasn't just sharing my story, I was rewriting it. As the program continued, the bakery thrived. The students from my classes dropped by after school, and the women from the mentorship group came in for coffee and advice. The shop became a small hub of community, each person carrying a piece of the story forward. But peace, I learned, is rarely final. One evening in late April, as I closed the register, the phone behind the counter rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something about it felt heavy. When I answered, the line was silent for a long time before a voice spoke. "Nora," my mother said softly, "we're moving away. Your father can't stay here anymore. People talk." Her voice cracked. We didn't realize how wrong things had gone until it was too late. I stood there, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. "Take care of yourself," she added. "You were always stronger than we knew." The line clicked before I could reply. I set the phone down and looked out through the front window. The street was quiet, the lamplight spilling across the wet pavement. Somewhere far away, I knew their house was dark, now its windows empty for the first time in decades. That night, I walked home in the rain. The sound of it against the sidewalk felt like an ending, but also somehow a beginning. I didn't know where they were going or if we'd ever speak again. What I did know was that I no longer needed an apology to move forward. The freedom I'd fought for wasn't theirs to give. It had been mine all along. When I reached my apartment, I stood at the window for a while, watching the rain slide down the glass. The city lights shimmered through it, blurred and distant. Tomorrow would come like it always did, with coffee, with laughter, with work that felt honest and whole. Still, as I turned away from the window, a quiet thought followed me. Peace had settled for now, but life has a way of testing what we think we've learned, and somewhere ahead I could feel that another reckoning was waiting, one that wouldn't break me this time, but prove just how far I'd come. The weeks after my parents' call felt oddly still. I moved through my days quietly, almost cautiously, as if waiting for an echo that never came. Spring folded into early summer, and Portland came alive again, the air heavy with the smell of rain-soaked soil and street vendors selling coffee stronger than mine. The bakery stayed full, the hum of conversation rising like background music I never tired of. One morning, Laura Chen, the journalist who had written the first article about me, walked in, holding a recorder and a paper cup. "I want to do a follow-up," she said, smiling softly. "People keep asking what happened after the court case. You've built something worth sharing." I hesitated, remembering how exposed I'd felt the last time. But she promised this story wouldn't be about pain. It would be about rebuilding. I agreed. She visited twice over the next week, taking photos of the shop during its busiest hours and sitting quietly as I worked. She watched how customers greeted me by name, how my staff, once just 2 part-timers, now worked like a small, happy family. When she interviewed me at closing one evening, she asked what had changed the most since everything happened. I thought for a moment before answering. "I stopped trying to be chosen," I said. "I just chose myself." She nodded, her eyes kind but knowing. The article ran the following Sunday under the title, "Bennett's Bakery: How Resilience Built a Community." It focused less on the lawsuit and more on what had grown afterward, the mentorship program, the high school classes, the people who'd found courage through something simple like baking or a kind word. The response was overwhelming. New customers came not because of curiosity, but out of quiet admiration. A week later, the city held its annual small business fair downtown. My booth was tucked between a florist and a honey vendor. The air smelled of sugar and lilacs, and sunlight glinted off the metal tables. I was serving pastries when I saw a familiar figure standing just beyond the crowd. For a second, I thought I'd imagined it. Then he stepped closer. It was my father. Harold looked thinner, his hair grayer than I remembered. He wore a jacket too big for him and carried himself with the kind of tiredness that doesn't come from age alone. When our eyes met, neither of us spoke at first. He cleared his throat and said quietly, "Your mother and I live in Idaho now. Smaller place, quieter." I nodded. He looked down at the rows of pastries and picked up one of the sample cards with my logo. "I heard you're doing well," he said. "Your uncle told me about the award." For a moment there was only the sound of chatter around us, the rustle of paper bags and children laughing nearby. I said softly, "I am." He gave a short nod, still staring at the table. "Your sister, she's getting help," he added. "Counseling, maybe work again someday." I didn't ask questions. The conversation wasn't about details, it was about recognition. He started to say something else, then stopped. His eyes, still the same pale blue I remembered from childhood, met mine again. "I didn't protect you," he said. "I let it happen because it was easier." The words landed like something old, finally being set down. I didn't cry. I just nodded once. "I know," I said. He reached into his pocket and placed a folded photograph on the table, me at 8 years old, holding a mixing bowl in our old kitchen flour, dusting my nose. "Your mother wanted you to have this," he said. Before I could reply, he stepped back. "Take care of yourself, Nora," he said, voice steady but distant. Then he walked away, blending into the slow-moving crowd until he was gone. That evening, I closed the shop early. I sat at one of the corner tables, the photo between my hands. The edges were worn, the colors faded. Behind me, the lights hummed softly, casting warm gold across the counter. I looked at the picture for a long time, remembering the rhythm of that small kitchen, the sound of the old oven door creaking open, my mother's voice calling from another room. The past didn't sting anymore. It just existed quiet and still, like something preserved. The next morning, when I unlocked the bakery, sunlight poured through the windows, soft and golden. A few early customers greeted me, unaware that something inside me had shifted overnight. I framed the photo and placed it near the register, where it caught the light each morning. 2 weeks later, Laura sent me a copy of her printed article with a handwritten note. "Your story is proof that justice isn't always loud, it's steady." I slipped the note into my apron pocket and kept it there for days. As summer deepened, life moved in new directions. The mentorship program expanded to a local college. Rebecca Kim introduced me to an investor who offered to help open a second location across town. My team cheered when I told them. "You're going to need a bigger kitchen," one of them joked. For once, the idea didn't feel overwhelming, it felt possible. Yet even in the middle of that new chapter, small reminders of the past appeared. A letter from Mason arrived one afternoon, written in uncertain handwriting. He apologized for what he'd done, said he was in therapy, and hoped to visit someday when it's not weird anymore. I wrote back a short note. "Keep learning, Mason. You're not your mistakes." I didn't know if it was the right thing to say, but it felt honest. Later that week, Tom stopped by with a bag of fresh bagels. He looked around at the busy shop and grinned. "You built this from ashes," he said. "That takes more than talent. It takes courage." I poured him coffee and we sat by the window watching people pass by outside. After a long pause, he said quietly, "Your father called me. He said he saw you." I didn't answer right away. Then I said, "He brought a photo." Tom smiled gently. "That sounds like him trying." We didn't speak much after that. Some silences don't need to be filled. That night as I walked home, the city lights shimmered on the wet pavement. The air smelled faintly of rain and baked bread from nearby shops. For the first time in years, my steps felt light. Not because everything was fixed, but because nothing needed fixing anymore. When I reached my apartment, I placed the framed photograph on my kitchen counter. I stood there a while looking at that little girl with flour on her nose and realized she finally looked safe. Outside, thunder rolled softly in the distance. The sky promised rain. Tomorrow I'd open the bakery early, greet customers by name, and keep building the life I'd chosen piece by piece. But as I turned off the lights that night, I had the quiet sense that something, peace, forgiveness, or maybe just understanding, had finally settled in for good. And though I couldn't see it yet, I knew that life was about to give me one last moment of closure, a chance to see just how far that quiet strength could reach. The following autumn arrived softer than any I could remember. The mornings began with fog drifting low over the streets, and the smell of baked bread carried farther in the chill. Inside the bakery, everything ran with a rhythm I could finally trust, the steady scrape of trays, the laughter from behind the counter, the quiet hum of a place built on peace rather than survival. One afternoon near closing, a delivery truck pulled up outside. The driver handed me a large box with no return address. Inside were smaller packages wrapped in brown paper, each labeled in neat handwriting. The top one held a simple note. "For your next chapter from someone learning what forgiveness means." I unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a set of embroidered kitchen towels, each stitched with small phrases: patience, courage, home. There was no signature, but the handwriting was unmistakably my mother's. I stood there for a long time, tracing the threads with my thumb. No letter, no apology, just a gesture quiet and unspoken, like a bridge that didn't ask to be crossed right away. I placed one towel near the sink and stored the rest in a drawer, not to forget them, but to keep them safe until I was ready to use them. In the weeks that followed, small changes found their way into my days. Mason sent a postcard from California where he'd joined his father. He wrote that he was volunteering with a youth art program and saving for college. His words were clumsy but honest, the way honesty often is when it's new. I kept the postcard pinned to the bulletin board in my office next to invoices and to-do lists. It reminded me that cycles could end and new ones could begin if you let them. The bakery continued to grow one slow morning at a time. I hired 2 more assistants and gave my manager, Claire, the freedom to run the store when I traveled. The mentorship program expanded beyond Portland, reaching small towns where women were starting businesses in garages, basements, and borrowed kitchens. Seeing their faces, women who had been overlooked, underestimated, and still refused to give up, felt like watching my own story ripple outward. In December, I was invited to speak at a conference in Seattle about resilience and ethical business practices. Standing on that stage, I looked out at hundreds of faces and thought about the girl I used to be, the one who thought silence was survival, who believed strength meant enduring anything. I told the audience what I'd learned the long way, that peace isn't found in avoiding storms, but in standing still when the wind tries to take you down. The applause that followed wasn't loud, but it was genuine, and that was enough. When I returned home that night, the bakery lights glowed through the window like a lantern waiting for me. I sat at the counter with a cup of coffee the same way I had years ago when everything first began to crumble. The city outside was quiet, and for the first time, I didn't feel the weight of what had been lost. I felt the space that loss had made the room to breathe, to grow, to choose joy without asking permission. A few days before Christmas, a letter arrived with an Idaho postmark. It was from my father. The handwriting was slower now, a little uneven. He wrote that my mother's health was fragile, but improving, and that they'd opened a small roadside cafe near their new home. He said it reminded them of mine, the smell of bread in the morning, the sound of laughter spilling from the kitchen. The letter ended simply, "You taught us something we didn't know we needed to learn. Thank you." I folded the letter and placed it beside the framed photograph of my younger self, the one my father had brought to the fair months before. The little girl with flour on her nose looked less like someone I used to be and more like someone I'd finally met again. That night I walked home through falling snow. The flakes drifted slowly, catching the light from street lamps, melting the moment they touched my hair. I thought of how far the story had traveled from a dinner table that once silenced me to a life that spoke for itself. The air was cold, but inside me was warmth, the kind that doesn't fade when the lights go out. Before bed, I wrote one last note on the bakery chalkboard for the morning crowd. Be kind. Even quiet strength changes everything. And as I turned off the lights, I whispered a small truth that had carried me here, that justice isn't about revenge, and love doesn't always mean staying. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is walk away, heal in peace, and let our lives speak the rest. If you've ever had to build yourself back from the ground up, I hope my story reminds you that peace is not the absence of pain, it's the proof that you kept going anyway. And if you're listening right now, take a moment to breathe, to remember your own strength, and to share this story with someone who might need it tonight.